They called it the Alcatraz of the Rockies, a place designed for silence, control, and total isolation. But in 2012, a group of forgotten men inside ADX Florence shattered that silence, not with violence, but with a lawsuit. What they revealed was darker than steel doors or razor wire, a hidden crisis of untreated mental illness in America's most secure prison. This is the story of Cunningham versus Bureau of Prisons, the case that forced the world to look inside a fortress no one was meant to see. The United States Penitentiary, Administrative Maximum Facility, better known as ADX Florence, opened its gates in 1994. Located in the high desert of Colorado, surrounded by the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, it was built to house the men considered too dangerous, too disruptive, or too high profile for anywhere else. Its inmates included terrorists, drug kingpins, cartel leaders, mafia bosses, and notorious figures like the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, Oklahoma City bomber Terry Nichols, and cartel boss Joaquin El Chapo Guzman after his extradition. It was, in every sense, the end of the line. Journalists, lawyers, and even prison officials called it a clean version of hell. Cells measured just 7 by 12 feet, with a concrete bed, a concrete desk, and a single narrow window angled so that inmates could only see the sky. Contact with other humans was virtually eliminated, meals delivered through slots, exercise alone in small dog-run cages, conversations shouted through steel doors. Even recreation was an extension of confinement. From the outside, ADX was praised as a necessary fortress, a solution for inmates who attacked guards, organized hits from behind bars, or masterminded escapes. But from the inside, critics argued it was a place where the human mind deteriorated. Inmates described the silence as crushing, the isolation as suffocating. Guards saw men pacing endless, talking to themselves, or smearing feces on the walls. Psychiatric symptoms weren't uncommon, they were inevitable. And yet, officially, ADX was not supposed to house prisoners with serious mental illness. Bureau of Prisons policies prohibited placing inmates with acute psychiatric conditions in such extreme isolation. Those men, in theory, should have been treated in medical facilities like the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina, or Springfield, Missouri. But that was theory. In practice, men with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression were sent to Florence and left to survive in silence. By the late 2000s, advocacy groups like Solitary Watch, the Marshall Project, and the American Civil Liberties Union began investigating conditions inside ADX. Stories emerged of men who mutilated themselves, swallowed razor blades, or screamed through the night. Suicide attempts were met not with therapy, but with disciplinary charges. Instead of care, there was punishment. Instead of treatment, there was paperwork. And for years, these stories remained largely invisible, buried behind the walls of America's most secure facility. Then, in June 2012, the silence broke. 11 prisoners, joined by outside attorneys and supported by organizations like the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs, filed a class action lawsuit in federal court. The case was named after the lead plaintiff, Troy Anderson Cunningham, and styled Cunningham versus Bureau of Prisons. It alleged something explosive, that ADX Florence had chronically failed to diagnose, treat, or even acknowledge serious mental illness, in violation of the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The lawsuit described ADX not just as a prison, but as a psychological pressure cooker. Men with paranoid schizophrenia, untreated depression, or post-traumatic stress were locked in cells for 22 to 24 hours a day, with little to no psychiatric support. Hallucinations were dismissed as disobedience. Self-harm was punished as misconduct. Requests for medical help were ignored, delayed, or answered with medications that inmates often did not understand or trust enough to take. According to the complaint, this wasn't just neglect. It was systemic, deliberate indifference to human suffering. The timing of the case was critical. By 2012, national attention on solitary confinement was growing. Investigative journalism, academic studies, and even former prison officials were speaking out about the mental health toll of long-term isolation. International bodies like the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture had begun to classify solitary confinement beyond 15 days as a form of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Suddenly, the Alcatraz of the Rockies wasn't just a symbol of toughness, it was becoming a symbol of controversy. The government's response was predictable: deny, delay, and defend. The Bureau of Prisons argued that ADX had adequate mental health procedures, that psychiatric staff were available, and that inmates who needed more intensive care could be transferred elsewhere. But discovery in the case, the process of gathering evidence, told a different story. Lawyers unearthed testimony, records, and medical files that showed a pattern. Mentally ill inmates not only remained at ADX, but they often deteriorated further while there. The Cunningham lawsuit would drag on for years, facing motions, appeals, and courtroom battles. But its significance was clear from the beginning. This was not just about one inmate or even 11. It was about the entire system of how the United States treated mentally ill prisoners in its harshest prison. If the plaintiffs succeeded, the Bureau of Prisons could be forced to reform policies not just at ADX but across federal institutions. If they failed, the silence of Florence would continue. As the legal fight escalated, disturbing details emerged. Letters from inmates describing hallucinations of voices that told them to cut themselves, reports of guards mocking suicide attempts, medical requests stamped denied. For many Americans, it was the first glimpse into a hidden world. The fortress had cracks, and through them came stories of pain. The battle lines were drawn: 11 prisoners versus the most powerful prison system in the world. At stake was not only justice for those inside ADX, but the broader question: does the United States torture its own citizens through isolation and neglect? The lawsuit Cunningham v. Bureau of Prisons wasn't just a stack of legal documents. It was a cry for help from men who had spent years in concrete boxes. 11 prisoners stepped forward, but their stories represented hundreds more. Each man became both a plaintiff and a witness to what prolonged isolation and untreated mental illness could do to the human mind. Troy Anderson Cunningham, the lead plaintiff whose name the case would carry, had a long history of psychiatric issues. Reports showed he had struggled with paranoia, auditory hallucinations, and bouts of severe depression. At ADX Florence, these symptoms were not treated as medical emergencies. Instead, they were met with disciplinary write-ups, as if hearing voices or self-harming were the same as breaking prison rules. Cunningham's attorneys argued that instead of stabilizing his condition, the prison worsened it by punishing behavior rooted in illness. Jack Powers. Perhaps the most haunting account came from Jack Powers, a man whose descent into self-destruction became emblematic of ADX's crisis. Powers had endured trauma long before his incarceration, but inside ADX, isolation drove him deeper into psychosis. Court documents and advocacy reports detailed his acts of self-mutilation, cutting his body with shards of metal, driving staples into his flesh, even attempting to amputate fingers. In one incident, he swallowed razors and broken glass. Instead of therapy, Powers was written up for destruction of government property, his own body. Powers once wrote, "I am in constant battle with my mind. The walls don't just keep me in, they close in on me." His story became so central to the case that even journalists who normally couldn't penetrate ADX's secrecy cited him as proof of systemic neglect. Mentally ill, but invisible. Another plaintiff, known only by initials in some records, described hearing voices commanding him to cut himself. Guards allegedly taunted him when he begged for psychiatric help. Others reported being placed on heavy psychotropic medications without clear explanations of side effects, then abruptly removed from them, triggering violent mood swings or psychotic breaks. One inmate described smearing feces across his cell walls in a state of confusion. Instead of intervention by mental health staff, he was left in isolation longer, deprived of basic privileges. For the Bureau of Prisons, these were disciplinary problems. For psychiatrists reviewing the case, these were hallmarks of untreated schizophrenia and severe depression. The evidence grows. As the lawsuit progressed, the attorneys gathered evidence showing that ADX was not an exception. It was a pattern. Medical evaluations were brief and superficial, often conducted through the crack of a cell door. Requests for treatment were routinely ignored or delayed. Inmates often had to wait weeks or months for a response to mental health grievances. And perhaps most damning, Bureau of Prisons documents revealed that staff knew about many of these issues, but did little to correct them. A key claim in the lawsuit was that ADX had no real system for identifying mentally ill prisoners at intake. Men with psychiatric diagnoses were sent there anyway, locked down and then forgotten. Some had their conditions worsened to the point of permanent disability. Others attempted suicide. In one account, an inmate repeatedly slashed himself, only to be patched up and returned to the same cell where his symptoms festered. Lawyers break through the silence. The Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, along with private attorneys and advocacy groups, began piecing these stories into a unified argument that ADX Florence was not just a prison, but a place where mental illness was effectively punished. They brought in psychiatric experts to testify that prolonged isolation without treatment could cause or exacerbate disorders like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and PTSD. The legal team highlighted a cruel irony. ADX was supposed to house the worst of the worst, men deemed too dangerous or manipulative for other prisons. But many of these so-called worst inmates were, in fact, too sick to be there at all. The human cost. By the time the case gained traction, several plaintiffs had attempted suicide. Some mutilated themselves so frequently that their bodies bore permanent scars. Others withdrew completely, losing the ability to interact even with their lawyers. For families on the outside, the lawsuit was the first time they learned just how badly their loved ones were suffering. Mothers, fathers, and siblings wrote affidavits describing the men they once knew, contrasting them with the broken voices they now heard. During short monitored phone calls, the plaintiffs' stories humanized a lawsuit that might otherwise have been buried in legal jargon. Each affidavit, each medical record, each photograph of scars became a piece of evidence not just in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion. The walls of ADX, designed to keep the world out, could not stop the truth from leaking through. The lawsuit was gaining momentum. But as Cunningham versus BOP moved forward, the Bureau of Prisons dug in, fighting to preserve the reputation of its most secure facility. What followed was years of courtroom battles, discovery disputes, and depositions that would expose just how deep the crisis ran. From the moment the lawsuit was filed in June 2012, the Bureau of Prisons, BOP, pushed back hard. Their legal team argued that ADX Florence already had adequate systems to address mental health, pointing to periodic check-ins and access to psychotropic medication. They claimed that inmates were exaggerating or fabricating symptoms. To admit otherwise would be to acknowledge a constitutional crisis inside America's highest security prison. But the discovery phase told another story. Lawyers representing the inmates uncovered medical logs showing that evaluations sometimes lasted less than 5 minutes. Internal memos revealed warnings from staff that were ignored. And expert psychiatrists testified that prolonged solitary confinement could cause psychiatric symptoms even in people who had no prior mental health diagnoses. In courtroom filings, the plaintiffs' attorneys cited the Eighth Amendment, the constitutional ban on cruel and unusual punishment. They argued that failing to treat mentally ill inmates while locking them in near-total isolation wasn't just negligence. It was deliberate indifference. The case gained national attention. Outlets like the Marshall Project, Solitary Watch, and the Washington Post began covering updates. For one of the first times, the phrase ADX Florence appeared in mainstream conversations not as a fortress of control, but as a site of possible human rights violations. International human rights groups compared it to torture. The government fought to have the case dismissed. Judges, however, allowed key claims to proceed. For years, the battle dragged on. Motions filed, depositions taken, psychiatric experts brought in. The evidence grew overwhelming. Inmates were deteriorating in plain sight, and the BOP had failed to act. Finally, in December 2016, after more than 4 years of litigation, the case reached a settlement. The Bureau of Prisons agreed to sweeping reforms. New mental health screenings at intake. Regular evaluations for all inmates. Limits on the use of psychotropic medications. Training for staff to recognize psychiatric symptoms. And most importantly, the transfer of over 100 mentally ill prisoners out of ADX Florence into facilities better equipped for treatment. It was a landmark moment. For the first time, America's most secure prison was forced to acknowledge what had long been denied, that inside its walls, mental illness had been left to rot in silence. The story of Cunningham vs. Bureau of Prisons didn't just change ADX Florence, it shifted the conversation about solitary confinement and mental health across the country. For the men who filed it, the lawsuit was more than legal paperwork. It was proof that even in the most forgotten corners of America's prison system, voices could still be heard. But this was only the beginning. The reforms raised a bigger question. In a system built on isolation and punishment, can mental health care truly exist? Or was Cunningham just the first crack in a wall that still stands today?